The Canadian, The Land of Promise, a novelization of W. Somerset Maugham's play. By D. Talbot. Second part. Chapter 3. Nora's surmise had been very nearly correct. The Wickhams were quarrelling, but not as yet over the spoils. James Wickham had waited until the door had closed behind his aunt's companion to rebuke his wife's untimely frivolity. "I say, Dorothy, you oughtn't to be facetious before Miss Marsh. She was extremely attached to Aunt Louisa." "Oh, what nonsense!" jeered Mrs. Wickham, throwing herself pettishly into a chair. "I find it's always a very good rule to judge people by oneself, and I'm positive she was just longing for the old lady to die. She was awfully upset at the end, you know that yourself." "Nerves! Men are so idiotic. They never understand that there are tears and tears. I cried myself, and heaven knows I didn't regret her death." "My dear Dorothy, you oughtn't to say that." "Why not?" retorted his wife. "It's perfectly true. Aunt Louisa was a detestable person, and no one would have stood her for a minute if she hadn't had money. I can't see the use of being a hypocrite now that it can't make any difference either way. Oh, why doesn't that man hurry up?" She resumed once more her impatient walk about the room. "I wish Wynne would come," said her husband, glad to change the subject, particularly as he felt that he had failed to be very impressive. "It'll be beastly inconvenient if we miss that train," he finished, glancing again at his watch. "And another thing," said Mrs. Wickham, turning sharply as she reached the end of the room, "I don't trust that Miss Marsh. She looks as if she knew what was in the will. I don't for a moment suppose she does. Aunt Louisa wasn't the sort of person to talk. Nevertheless, I'm sure she knows she's been left something. Oh, well, I think she has the right to expect that. Aunt Louisa led her a dog's life." Mrs. Wickham made an angry gesture. She had her wages and a comfortable home. If she didn't like the place, she could have left it, she said pettishly. "After all," she went on in a quieter tone, "it's family money. In my opinion, Aunt Louisa had no right to leave it to strangers." "I don't think we ought to complain if Miss Marsh gets a small annuity," said her husband soothingly. "I understand Aunt Louisa promised her something of the sort when she had a chance of marrying a couple of years ago." "Miss Marsh is still quite young. It isn't as if she had been here for 30 years, protested Mrs. Wickham. "Well, anyway, I've got an idea that Aunt Louisa meant to leave her about $250 a year. 250? But what's the estate amount to? Have you any idea?" "About £19,000, I believe." Mrs. Wickham, who had seated herself once more, struck her hands violently together. "Oh, it's absurd. It's a most unfair proposition. It will make all the difference to us. On that extra $250 a year, we could keep a car." "My dear, be thankful if we get anything at all," said her husband solemnly. For a moment, she stared at him aghast. "Jim! Jim, you don't think— Oh, that would be too horrible." "Hush. Take care." He crossed to the window as the door opened and Kate came in softly with the tea things. "How lucky it is that we had a fine day," he said, endeavoring to give the impression that they had been talking with becoming sobriety of light topics. He hoped his wife's raised voice had not been heard in the passageway. But Mrs. Wickham was beyond caring. Her toneless "yes" in response to his original observation betrayed her utter lack of interest in the subject. But as Kate was still busy setting out the things on a small table, he continued his efforts. "Really, Dorothy should play up more. It looks as if we were going to have a spell of fine weather." "Yes. It's funny how often it rains for weddings." "Very funny." "The tea is ready, sir." As Kate left the room, Mrs. Wickham crossed slowly over to where her husband was standing in front of the window leading to the garden. Her voice shook with emotion. It was evident that she was very near tears. He put his arm around her awkwardly, but with a certain suggestion of protective tenderness. "I've been counting on that money for years," she said, hardly above a whisper. "I used to dream at night that I was reading a telegram with the news of Aunt Louisa's death, and I've thought of all we should be able to do when we get it. It'll make such a difference." You know what she was. She didn't care twopence for us. "We ought to be prepared for the worst," he said soberly. "Do you think she could have left everything to Miss Marsh?" "I shouldn't be greatly surprised." "We'll dispute the will," she said, once more raising her voice. "It's undue influence. I suspected Miss Marsh from the beginning. I hate her. Oh, how I hate her. Oh, why doesn't Wynne come?" A ring at the bell answered her. "Here he is, I expect. The suspense is too awful." "Pull yourself together, old girl," said Wickham, patting his wife encouragingly on the shoulder. "And I say, look a bit dismal. After all, we've just come from a funeral." Mrs. Wickham gave a sort of suppressed wail. "Oh, I'm downhearted enough, heaven knows." "Mr. Wynne, sir," said Kate from the doorway. Mr. Wynne, the late Miss Wickham's solicitor, was a jovial, hearty man, tallish, bald and ruddy-looking. In his spare time, he played at being a country gentleman. He had a fine, straightforward eye and a direct manner that inspired one with confidence. He was dressed in complimentary mourning, but for the moment his natural hearty manner threatened to get the better of him. "Hello," he said, holding out his hand to Wickham. But the sight of Mrs. Wickham, seated on the sofa dejectedly enough, recalled to him that he should be more subdued in the presence of such genuine grief. He crossed the room to take Dorothy's hand solemnly. "I didn't have an opportunity of shaking hands with you at the cemetery." "How do you do?" she said, rather absently. "Pray accept my sincerest sympathy on your great bereavement." Mrs. Wickham made an effort to bring her mind back from the all-absorbing fear that possessed her. Of course, the end was not entirely unexpected. "No, I know, but it must have been a great shock all the same." He was going on to say what a wonderful old lady his late client had been, in that her faculties seemed perfectly unimpaired until the very last, when Wickham interrupted him. Not only was he most anxious to hear the will read himself and have it over, but he saw signs in his wife's face and in the nervous manner in which she rolled and unrolled her handkerchief that she was nearing the end of her self-control, never very great. "My wife was very much upset, but of course my poor aunt had suffered great pain, and we couldn't help looking upon it as a happy release." "Naturally," responded the solicitor sympathetically. "And how is Miss Marsh?" He was looking at James Wickham as he spoke, so that he missed the sudden "I told you so" glance which Mrs. Wickham flashed at her husband. "Oh, she's very well," she managed to say with a careless air. "I'm glad to learn that she is not completely prostrated," said Mr. Wynne warmly. "Her devotion to Miss Wickham was perfectly wonderful. Dr. Evans, he's my brother-in-law, you know, told me no trained nurse could have been more competent. She was like a daughter to Miss Wickham." "I suppose we'd better send for her," said Mrs. Wickham coldly. "Have you brought the—" Wickham stopped in embarrassment. "Yes, I have it in my pocket," said the solicitor quickly. He had noted before now how awkward people always were about speaking of wills. There was nothing indelicate about doing so. Heavens, all right-minded persons made their wills, and they meant to have them read after they were dead. Everybody knew that, and yet they always acted as if it were indecent to approach the subject. He had no patience with such nonsense. With an eloquent look at her husband, Mrs. Wickham slowly crossed the room to the bell. "I'll ring for Miss Marsh," she said in a hard voice. "I expect Mr. Wynne would like a cup of tea, Dorothy." She frowned at her husband behind the solicitor's broad back. More delays. Could she bear it? "Oh, I'm so sorry, I quite forgot about it." "No, thank you very much. I never take tea," protested that gentleman. He took from his pocket a long blue envelope and slowly drew from it the will, which he smoothed out with a deliberation which was maddening to Mrs. Wickham. She could hardly tear her fascinated eyes away from it long enough to tell the waiting Kate to ask Miss Marsh to be good enough to come to them. "What's the time, Jim?" she asked nervously. "Oh, there's no hurry," he said, looking at his watch without seeing it. Then turning to Wynne, he added, "We've got an important engagement this evening in London, and we're very anxious not to miss the fast train." "The train service down here is rotten," said Mrs. Wickham harshly. "That's all right. The will is very short. It won't take me 2 minutes to read it," Mr. Wynne reassured them. "What on earth is Miss Marsh doing?" said Mrs. Wickham, half to herself. An endless minute passed. "How pretty the garden is looking now," said the solicitor cheerfully, gazing out through the window. "Very," Wickham managed to say. Miss Wickham was always so interested in her garden. "Yes. My own tulips aren't so advanced as those." "Aren't they?" Wickham's tone suggested irritation. Mr. Wynne addressed his next observation to Mrs. Wickham. "Are you interested in gardening?" "No, I hate it, at last." The exclamation was called forth by the appearance of Nora in the doorway. The two men both rose, Wynne to go forward and shake Nora's hand with unaffected cordiality, Wickham to whisper in his wife's ear, beseeching her to exercise more self-control. "How do you do, Miss Marsh? I'm rejoiced to see you looking so fit." "Oh, I'm very well, thank you. How do you do?" "Will you have a cup of tea?" asked Wickham, in response to what he thought was a signal from his wife. But Mrs. Wickham had reached the point where further waiting was simply impossible. "Jim," she remonstrated, "Miss Marsh would much prefer to have tea quietly after we're gone." Nora understood, and for the moment found it in her heart to be sorry for the woman, much as she disliked her. "I won't have any tea, thank you," she said simply. "Mr. Wynne has brought the will with him," explained Mrs. Wickham. Her tone was almost appealing, as if she begged Nora, if she knew of its contents, to say so without further delay. "Oh, yes." Nothing should induce her to show such agitation as this woman did. She managed to assume an air of polite interest and find a chair for herself quite calmly. And yet she was conscious that her heart was beating wildly beneath her bodice. But she would not betray herself, she would not. And yet her stake was as great as any. Her whole future hung on the contents of that paper Mr. Wynne was caressing with his long fingers. "Miss Marsh," questioned Mr. Wynne as soon as she was seated, "so far as you know, there is no other will." "How do you mean?" "Miss Wickham didn't make a later one. Without my assistance, I mean. You know of nothing in the house, for instance?" "Oh, no," said Nora positively. "Miss Wickham always said you had her will. She was extremely methodical." "I feel I ought to ask you," the solicitor went on with unwonted gentleness, "because Miss Wickham consulted me a couple of years ago about making a new will. She told me what she wanted to do, but gave me no actual instructions to draw it. I thought perhaps she might have done it herself." "I heard nothing about it. I am sure that her only will is in your hands." "Then I think that we may take it that this—" Mrs. Wickham's set face relaxed. The light of triumph was in her eyes. She understood. "When was that will made?" she asked eagerly. 8 or 9 years ago. The exact date was March 4th, 1904. The date settled it. Nora, too, realized that. She was left penniless. What a refinement of cruelty to deceive. But she must not think of that now. She would have all the rest of her life in which to think of it. But here before that woman, whose searching glance was even now fastened on her face to see how she was taking the blow, she would give no sign. "When did you first come to Miss Wickham?" Mrs. Wickham's voice was almost a caress. "At the end of 1903. There was no trace of emotion in that clear voice. After a moment, Mr. Wynne spoke again. "Shall I read it? Or would you just like to know the particulars? It is very short." Oh, let us know just roughly. Mrs. Wickham was still eager. Well, Miss Wickham left £100 to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and £100 to the General Hospital at Tunbridge Wells, and the entire residue of her fortune to her nephew, Mr. James Wickham. Mrs. Wickham drew her breath sharply. Once more she looked at her late aunt's companion, but nothing was to be read in that calm face. She was a designing minx, nonetheless. But she did yield her a grudging admiration for her self-control in the shipwreck of all her hopes. Now they could have their car. Oh, what couldn't they have? She felt she had earned every penny of it in that last dreadful half-hour. "And Miss Marsh?" she heard her husband ask. "Miss Marsh is not mentioned." Somehow Nora managed a smile. "I could hardly expect to be. At the time that will was drawn, I had been Miss Wickham's companion for only a few months." "That is why I asked whether you knew of any later will," said Mr. Wynne, almost sadly. "When I talked to Miss Wickham on the subject, she said her wish was to make adequate provision for you after her death. I think she had spoken to you about it." "Yes, she had. She mentioned 300 a year. That was very kind of her." Nora's voice broke a little. "I'm glad she wished to do something for me. Oddly enough," continued the solicitor, "she spoke about it to Dr. Evans only a few days before she died." "Perhaps there is a later will somewhere," said Wickham. "I honestly don't think so." "Oh, I'm sure there isn't," affirmed Nora. "Dr. Evans was talking to Miss Wickham about Miss Marsh. She was completely tired out, and he wanted Miss Wickham to have a professional nurse. She told him then that I had the will, and that she had left Miss Marsh amply provided for." "That isn't legal, of course," said Mrs. Wickham decidedly. "What isn't?" "I mean, no one could force us. I mean, the will stands as it is, doesn't it?" "Certainly it does." "I'm afraid it's a great disappointment to you, Miss Marsh," Wickham said, not unkindly. "I never count my chickens before they're hatched." This time Nora smiled easily and naturally. The worst was over now. "It would be very natural if Miss Marsh were disappointed in the circumstances. I think she'd been led to expect—" Mr. Wynne's voice was almost pleading. Mrs. Wickham detected a certain disapproval in the tone. She hastened to justify herself. He might still be useful. When the estate was once settled, they would of course put everything in the hands of their London solicitor, but it would be better not to antagonize him for the moment. Our aunt left a very small fortune, I understand, and I suppose she felt it wouldn't be fair to leave a large part of it away from her own family." "Of course," said her husband, following her lead, "it is family money. She inherited it from my grandfather, and— But I want you to know, Miss Marsh, that my wife and I thoroughly appreciate all you did for my aunt. Money couldn't repay your care and devotion. You've been perfectly wonderful." "It's extremely good of you to say so. I think everyone who saw Miss Marsh with Miss Wickham must be aware that during the 10 years she was with her, she never spared herself." Mr. Wynne's eyes were on Mrs. Wickham. "Of course my aunt was a very trying woman," began James Wickham feebly. His wife headed him off. "Earning one's living is always unpleasant. If it weren't, there'd be no incentive to work." This astonishing aphorism was almost too much for Nora's composure. She gave Mrs. Wickham an amused glance, to which that lady responded by beaming upon her in her most agreeable manner. "My wife and I would be very glad to make some kind of acknowledgement of your services." "I was just going to mention it," echoed Mrs. Wickham heartily. Mr. Wynne's kindly face brightened visibly. He was glad they were going to do the right thing after all. He had been a little fearful a few moments before. "I felt sure that in the circumstances—" But Mrs. Wickham interrupted him quickly. "What were your wages, may I ask, Miss Marsh?" £30 a year." "Really?" in a tone of excessive surprise. "Many ladies are glad to go as companion without any salary, just for the sake of a home and congenial society," I dare say you've been able to save a good deal in all these years." "I had to dress myself decently, Mrs. Wickham," said Nora frigidly. Mrs. Wickham was graciousness itself. "Well, I'm sure my husband will be very glad to give you a year's salary, won't you, Jim?" "It's very kind of you," replied Nora coldly, "but I'm not inclined to accept anything but what is legally due to me." "You must remember," went on Mrs. Wickham, "that there'll be very heavy death duties to pay. They'll swallow up the income from Miss Wickham's estate for at least 2 years, won't they, Mr. Wynne?" "I quite understand," said Nora. "Perhaps you'll change your mind." "I don't think so." There was an awkward pause. Mr. Wynne rose from his seat at the table. His manner showed unmistakably that he was not impressed by Mrs. Wickham's great generosity. "Well, I think I must leave you," he said, looking at Nora. "Goodbye, Miss Marsh. If I can be of any help to you, I hope you'll let me know." "That's very kind of you." Bowing slightly to Mrs. Wickham and nodding to her husband, he went out. "We must go too, Dorothy," said James uneasily. Mrs. Wickham began drawing on her gloves. "Jim will be writing to you in a day or two. You know how grateful we both are for all you did for our poor aunt. We shall be glad to give you the very highest references. You're such a wonderful nurse. I'm sure you'll have no difficulty in getting another situation. I expect I can find you something myself. I'll ask among all my friends." Nora made no reply to this affable speech. "Come on, Dorothy, we really haven't any time to lose," said Wickham hurriedly. "Goodbye, Miss Marsh." "Goodbye," said Nora dully. She stood, her hands resting on the table, her eyes fastened on the long blue envelope which Mr. Wynne had forgotten. From a long way off, she heard the wheels of the cab on the driveway. Chapter 4. "I thought they were never going. Well?" It was Miss Pringle who had come in from her retreat in the garden, eager to hear the news the moment she had seen the Wickhams driving away. Nora turned and looked at her without a word. Miss Pringle was genuinely startled at the drawn look on her face. "Nora, what's the matter? Isn't it as much as you thought?" "Miss Wickham has left me nothing," said Nora in a dead voice. Miss Pringle gave a positive wail of anguish. "Oh, not a penny." "Oh, it's cruel," the girl said almost wildly. "After all," she went on bitterly, "there was no need for her to leave me anything. She gave me board and lodging and £30 a year. If I stayed, it was because I chose. But she needn't have promised me anything. She needn't have prevented me from marrying." "My dear, you could never have married that little assistant. He wasn't a gentleman," Miss Pringle reminded her. 10 years, the 10 best years of a woman's life when other girls are enjoying themselves. And what did I get for it? Board and lodging and £30 a year. A cook does better than that." "We can't expect to make as much money as a good cook," said Miss Pringle, with touching and unconscious pathos. "One has to pay something for living like a lady among people of one's own class." "Oh, it's cruel," Nora could only repeat. "My dear," said Miss Pringle with an effort at consolation, "don't give way. I'm sure you'll have no difficulty in finding another situation. You wash lace beautifully, and no one can arrange flowers like you." Nora sank wearily into a chair. "And I was dreaming of France and Italy. I shall spend 10 years more with an old lady, and then she'll die, and I shall look out for another situation. It won't be so easy then because I shan't be so young, and so it'll go on until I can't find a situation because I'm too old, and then some charitable people will get me into a home. You like the life, don't you?" "My dear, there are so few things a gentlewoman can do." "When I think of those 10 years," said Nora, pacing up and down the length of the room, "having to put up with every unreasonableness, never being allowed to feel ill or tired. No servant would have stood what I have. The humiliation I've endured." "You're tired and out of sorts," said Miss Pringle soothingly. "Everyone isn't so trying as Miss Wickham. I'm sure Mrs. Hubbard has been kindness itself to me." Considering, I don't know what you mean by considering. Considering that she's rich and you're poor, she gives you her old clothes. She frequently doesn't ask you to have dinner by yourself when she's giving a party. She doesn't remind you that you're a dependent, unless she's very much put out. But you've had 30 years of it. You've eaten the bitter bread of slavery till it tastes like plum cake. Miss Pringle was distinctly hurt. I don't know why you say such things to me, Nora. Oh, you mustn't mind what I say. Mr. Hornby would like to see you for a minute, miss, said Kate from the doorway. Now? I told him I didn't think it would be very convenient, miss, but he says it's very important and he won't detain you more than 5 minutes. What a nuisance. Ask him to come in. Very good, miss. I wonder what on earth he can want. Who is he, Nora? Oh, he's the son of Colonel Hornby. Don't you know he lives at the top of Molyneux Park? His mother was a great friend of Miss Wickham's. He comes down here now and then for weekends. He's got something to do with motor cars. Mr. Hornby, said Kate from the door. Reginald Hornby was evidently one of those candid souls who are above simulating an emotion they do not feel. He had regarded the late Miss Wickham as an unusually tiresome old woman. His mother had liked her, of course, but he could hardly have been expected to do so. Moreover, he had a shrewd notion that she must have been a perfect Tartar to live with. Miss Marsh might be busy or tired out with the ordeal of the day, but as she also might be leaving almost immediately and he wanted to see her, he had not hesitated to come, once he was sure that the Wickham relatives had departed. That he would find the late Miss Wickham's companion indulging in any show of grief for her late employer had never entered his head. He was a good-looking, if rather vacuous young man with a long, elegant body. His dark, sleek hair was always carefully brushed, and his small moustache trimmed and curled. His beautiful clothes suggested the fashionable tailors of Savile Row. Everything about him, his tie, his handkerchief protruding from his breast pocket, his boots, bore the stamp of the very latest thing. I say, I'm awfully sorry to blow in like this, he said airily. He beamed on Nora, whom he had always regarded as much too pretty a girl to be what he secretly called a frosy companion, and sent a quick, inquiring glance at Miss Pringle, whom he vaguely remembered to have seen somewhere in Tunbridge Wells. But then, Tunbridge Wells was filled with frumps. Oh, yes, he remembered now. She was usually to be seen leading a pair of poms on a leash. You see, I didn't know if you'd be staying on here, he went on, retaining Nora's hand, and I wanted to catch you. I'm off in a day or two myself. Won't you sit down? Mr. Hornby, Miss Pringle. How do you do? Mr. Hornby's glance skimmed lightly over Miss Pringle's surface and returned at once to Nora's more pleasing face. Everything go off okay? He inquired genially. I beg your pardon? Funeral, I mean. Mother went. Regular outing for her. Miss Pringle stiffened visibly in her chair and began to study the pattern in the rug at her feet with an absorbed interest. Nora was conscious of a wild desire to laugh, but with a heroic effort succeeded in keeping her face straight out of deference to her elderly friend. Really? She said in a faint voice. Oh, yes, went on young Hornby with unabated cheerfulness. You see, Mother's getting on. I'm the child of her old age. Benjamin, don't you know? Benjamin and Sarah, you know, he explained, apparently for the benefit of Miss Pringle, as he pointedly turned to address this final remark to her. I understand perfectly, said Miss Pringle icily, but it wasn't Sarah. Wasn't it? When one of her old friends dies, he went on to Nora, Mother always goes to the funeral and says to herself, well, I've seen her out anyhow. Then she comes back and eats muffins for tea. She always eats muffins after she's been to a funeral. So, the maid said you wanted to see me about something in particular, Nora gently reminded him. That's right. I was forgetting. He wheeled suddenly once more on Miss Pringle, who had arrived at that stage in her study of the rug when she was carefully tracing out the pattern with the point of her umbrella. If Sarah wasn't Benjamin's mother, whose mother was she? "If you want to know, I recommend you to read your Bible," retorted that lady with something approaching heat. Mr. Hornby slapped his knee. "I thought it was a stumper," he remarked with evident satisfaction. "The fact is, I'm going to Canada, and Mother told me you had a brother or something out there." "A brother, not a something," said Nora with a smile. "And she said, perhaps you wouldn't mind giving me a letter to him." "I will with pleasure, but I'm afraid he won't be much use to you. He's a farmer, and he lives miles away from anywhere." "But I'm going in for farming." "You are? What on earth for?" "I've jolly well got to do something," said Hornby with momentary gloom, "and I think farming's about the best thing I can do. One gets a lot of shooting and riding, yon know, and then there are tennis parties and dances, and you make a pot of money, there's no doubt about that." "But I thought you were in some motor business in London." "Well, I was, in a way, but I thought you'd have heard about it. Mother's been telling everybody. Governor won't speak to me. Altogether, things are rotten. I want to get out of this beastly country as quick as I can." "Would you like me to give you the letter at once?" said Nora, going over to an escritoire that stood near the window. "I wish you would. Fact is," he went on, addressing no one in particular, as Nora was already deep in her letter, and Miss Pringle, having exhausted the possibilities of the rug, was gazing stonily into space. "I'm broke. I was all right as long as I stuck to bridge. I used to make money on that, over 1,000 a year." "What?" Horror was stronger than Miss Pringle's resolution to take no further part in the conversation with this extraordinary and apparently unprincipled young man. "Playing regularly, you know. If I hadn't been a fool, I'd have stuck to that, but I got bitten with chemie." "With what?" asked Nora over her shoulder. "Chemin de fer. Never heard of it? I got in the habit of going to Thornton's. I suppose you never heard of him either. He keeps a gambling hell, gives you a slap-up supper for nothing, as much pop as you can drink, and cashes your checks like a bird. The result is, I've lost every bob I had, and then Thornton sued me on a check I'd given him. The governor forked out, but he says I've got to go to Canada. I'm never going to gamble again, I can tell you that." "Oh, well, that's something," murmured Nora cheerfully. "You can't make money at Chemis," went on Hornby, relapsing once more into gloom. "The Cagnot's bound to clear you out in the end. When I come back, I'm going to stick to bridge. There are always plenty of mugs about, and if you have a good head for cards, you can't help making an income out of it." "But I thought you said you were never going—" began Miss Pringle, but thinking better of it, abandoned her sentence in mid-air. "Here is your letter," said Nora, holding it out to him. "Thanks. Awfully. I dare say I shan't want it, you know. I expect I shall get offered a job the moment I land, but there's no harm having it. I'll be getting along. Goodbye, then, and good luck." "Goodbye," he said, shaking hands with Nora and Miss Pringle. "Nora, why don't you go out to Canada?" said Miss Pringle thoughtfully, as soon as the door had closed after young Hornby. "Now your brother has a farm of his own, I should think—" "My brother's married," interrupted Nora quickly. "He married 4 years ago. You never told me." "I couldn't." "Why? Isn't his wife nice?" "She was a waitress at a scrubby little hotel in Winnipeg." "What are you going to do then?" "I'm going to look out for another situation." Miss Pringle shook her head sadly. "Well, I must be going. Mrs. Hubbard will be back from her drive by this time. She's sure to have you in for tea or something before you go. She's always been quite fond of you. At any rate, I'll see you again, of course." "Oh, yes, indeed." Nora was thankful to be alone once more. She wanted to think it all out. What a day it had been! Starting with such high hopes to end only in utter disaster. She felt completely exhausted by the emotions she had undergone. Time enough to plan tomorrow. Tonight, She needed rest. 2 days later, in the late afternoon, she found herself in the train for London, the second journey she had taken in 10 years. Once, 3 years before, Miss Wickham had been persuaded to go up and pay the James Wickhams a short visit, and had taken Nora with her. It could hardly have been described as a pleasure trip. Miss Wickham detested visiting, and had only yielded to her nephew's importunities because she had never been in his London house to stay any time, and had an avid curiosity to see how they lived. She had, of course, disapproved of everything she saw about the establishment. But, as it was no part of her purpose to let the fact be known to her relatives, she had in a large measure vented her consequent ill humour upon her unfortunate companion. The last few days had seemed full indeed. No matter how little one may really care for a place, the process of uprooting after 10 years is not an easy one. Mr. Wynne had been to see her to renew his offer of assistance and counsel in any plan she might have for the future, and she had spent an hour with the good doctor and his wife. The dreaded invitation from Mrs. Hubbard had duly arrived and had turned out to be for dinner, an extraordinary honour. Nora had accepted it entirely on Miss Pringle's account. Mrs. Hubbard had been condescension itself, and had even gone the length of excusing Miss Pringle from the evening's game of bezique, in order that she might have a farewell chat with her friend. She had mildly deprecated Miss Wickham's carelessness in not altering her will, but had reminded Miss Marsh that she should be grateful to her late employer for having had such kindly intentions toward her, vaguely ending her remarks with the statement that, as her dear husband had always said, in this imperfect world one had often to consider intentions. It was from her more humble friends that Nora found it hardest to part. She had had tea with the gardener's wife and children, of whom she was genuinely fond. But it was the parting from Kate that had brought the tears to her eyes. She had confided to that motherly soul how large she had loomed in the rosy plans she had made, while she still had expectations from Miss Wickham, and been assured in turn that Kate couldn't have fancied herself happier than she would have been in looking after her, and the faithful Kate refused to regard the plan as anything more than postponed. It developed that she was an adept in telling fortunes with tea leaves. She hoped her dear Miss Marsh wouldn't consider it a liberty for her to say so, but in every forecast that Kate had made for herself in the last 12th month, Miss Marsh had always been mixed up, which showed beyond the peradventure of a doubt that they were to meet again. It was already dusk when London was reached, but Nora had an address of an inexpensive little private hotel which the doctor's wife had given her. She had written ahead to engage a room so that her mind was at ease on that subject. Not knowing exactly where the street might be, further than that it led off the Strand, she indulged herself in the novel luxury of a taxi and drove to her new lodgings in state. "If it isn't too much out of the way, would you take me by way of Trafalgar Square, please?" The chauffeur touched his cap. His "yes, miss" was non-committal. She was conscious of an unusual feeling of exultation as she went along. London, while it can be one of the most depressing cities in the world when one is alone and friendless, quickens the imagination. As they went through Trafalgar Square and caught a fleeting glimpse of the National Gallery, Nora resolved that she would give herself a real treat and renew old acquaintance with that institution, as well as see the Wallace Collection and the Tate Gallery, both of which would be new to her. She realized more poignantly than ever how starved her love of beauty had been for the last 10 years. It awoke in her afresh with the thought that for a few days at least she could permit herself the luxury of gratifying it. She was shown to her room by a neat maid who said she would see what might be done in the way of a light tea. As a rule, breakfast was the only repast that was supposed to be furnished, but she was quite sure Miss Horne, the proprietor, would, in view of the fact that the young lady was a stranger in London and would hardly know where to go alone for a bite of dinner, make an exception. Nora thanked her and set about making the bare little room, which was quite at the top of the house. look a little more homelike by unpacking some of her own things. After all, she reflected, it wasn't much less cheerful than the room she had had for 10 years. Perhaps her late participation in the splendours of Miss Wickham's guest chamber, which had been part of Dr. Evans's prescription, had spoiled her for simpler joys. She laughed aloud at the thought. By the time she had had her supper, which was sufficiently good, and written a few notes, one to the doctor's wife to say that she thought she would be quite comfortable in her new quarters, and one to the head of the agency through which she had obtained her post with Miss Wickham, Nora found herself ready for bed. The next day dawned bright and fine, one of those delightful spring days to which the great city occasionally treats you as if to protest against the injustice of her reputation for being dark and gloomy. There were a number of pleasant-looking people in the coffee room when Nora went down to breakfast, which turned out to be abundant and well-cooked. Having inquired her direction, a sense of location was not one of her gifts. She set out gaily enough for a whole day of sightseeing. She might never get another position and have eventually to go out as a charwoman. The detail that she would be illy equipped for any such undertaking she humorously dismissed, but a day or two of unalloyed enjoyment she was going to have, come what might. The day was a complete success. Having done several of the picture galleries, lunched and dined frugally at one of the ABC restaurants, Nora returned at nightfall, tired but happy. Oh, the blessed freedom of it. The next morning on coming downstairs, she found at her plate a letter from the agency. The management of affairs, it seemed, had passed into other hands. Doubtless Miss Marsh's name would be found on the books of several years back, but it was not familiar to the new director. However, they would, of course, be pleased to put themselves at Miss Marsh's service. If she would be good enough to give them an early call, bringing any and all references she might have, etc., etc. Miss Marsh tore the note into tiny fragments. The agency could wait, everything could wait, for the moment. She must have her fling, the first taste of freedom in all these years. After that,